and good morning, everybody. My name is Christian Wilde. Really appreciate you joining us today, especially live. Like I said, my name is Christian Wilde. I'm the Chief Product Officer at Certs. And before that, I've spent years at Microsoft leading our global scaling of technical skilling and all of our credential programs for the millions of learners worldwide, as well as the enterprises.
And good day, everyone. I'm Jeff Felice, the Chief Operating Officer for AI Labs 365. I spend my time on the practical side of the problem, how do credential programs operate at scale, where they break, and what it takes to make them defensible for enterprises, institutions, and regulators. Before we begin, a quick note on format. We're going to spend about 5 minutes on kickoff and introductions, about 30 to 40 minutes walking through the content, and then we're going to reserve about 15 minutes for questions at the end. So here's the promise for today. If you're responsible for credentials in any form, whether that's university diplomas, professional certifications, workforce compliance credentials, or internal enterprise credential programs, you're facing the same underlying problem. And as we know, the world is moving faster, the environment is getting more complex, and static credentials were not designed to survive a dynamic threat landscape. So Christian, let's jump in.
Yeah, let's move to the next slide if we can. So when we think about the threat landscape that exists today, it's important to kind of take a step back. Credentials, in theory, have always represented trust in the ecosystem, right? In the past, they're shorthand signal for that people have completed training, they've passed an assessment, they've met the requirements. Or qualified in some way. But the crisis that's at hand is that at enterprise scale, trust is much harder now to maintain. Not because credentials are less important, in fact, the opposite, but because the context and the market has shifted so dramatically around them. Credentials are being issued in higher volumes than ever before. They're being shared across systems like they haven't in the past. They're being used across regions and jurisdictions, and they're being relied on much more for higher stakes decisions than they ever been in the past. So things like hiring, access, licensing, safety, compliance, and especially with AI, credentials are going to have a much more front and center view of the world. And so, in other words, credentials have really become institutional infrastructure. But most credential programs still operate like they're issuing a static artifact, a PDF, a badge image, a record in one platform. And those static artifacts really can't keep up with what's happening in the world and the market right now. And so in terms of, if you want to move to the next slide, in terms of why it's important right now to act, there's really a number of forces, but the ones that come to mind for me that really drive home the fact that the old model is unsustainable is the first is fraud. Credential fraud, identity fraud, impersonation, forged certificates, manipulated records. We're hearing about this every single day in the news, one way or the other, right? And the biggest driver underneath this is credential compromise. And we're seeing huge increases year over year. You can see the 160% increase reported here from Checkpoint. And the way to think about that is, compromised credentials are rising sharply, and that directly fuels credential fraud and misuse. And it makes sense because the stakes are higher now, and so there's more motivation for people to use the fraud and to drive fraud. And so now the question is, how do we think about that? The second big force around regulation, there's increased expectations from regulators around proof and traceability and auditability, right? So it's not enough to just say that a credential exists. You need to prove it's valid. You've got to make sure it's current and governed. The third is mobility as a force. Like I said, people are moving across employers and geographies and institutions more than ever. People are in many places more than one institution at one point in time. And so credentials need to travel with the individual, not necessarily be maintained in a static repository somewhere. And lastly, I mentioned a little bit before, is the increased reliance on compliance and the increased force there. organizations are expected to know on a continuous basis whether people in regulator roles hold current valid credentials, and that expectation doesn't jive well with the way that manual verification and static artifacts exist today. So, you can't. We're in a world where trust can't be assumed, and it has to be really thoughtful and engineered from the get-go. And so, as we continue forward and we think about today's challenges, if you want to move forward, there you go. It's important to think about why is trust breaking specifically, right? One, historically, certifications and badges really were built for individuals, not really for enterprise governance. They were, historically, they've been optimized for recognition and sharing, and not really for lifecycle control, auditability, and reinforcement. And, the requirements of today did not necessarily exist the way they did in the past, nor did the sophistication. Second, verification today depends on manual workflows that really just don't scale. Email, manually looking it up, calling, having someone confirm status. It just takes too much time, right? Turnaround times are too high. And especially with the world we live in now, that it becomes really cumbersome to do that verification. Thirdly, static credentials, as I mentioned before, it's really hard to enforce life cycle and compliance and policy. They can't expire themselves, they can't renew themselves, they can't revoke themselves in essence. And so how do you make sure that there's a way to signal that status consistently across every place that they might be verified? Today, most of the time, people are relying on those static certificates or credentials, and really it becomes difficult to validate that across many different constructs. And then, as I mentioned before, audit expectations, especially with AI, when you think about all the AI regulations that are coming up and the need to prove auditability, there's this continuous automated traceability that's required, and it can't be a one-time thing. It needs to be on an ongoing basis, continuous and traceable, and something that is easy for organizations to do, right? So it's all about how do you govern them over time. So as we think about what does trust mean at scale, really, it means that we need to think about this in terms of defining the standard, right? And so for enterprises and institutions, there's certainly more requirements, but the 5 core requirements, as we think about them, you can see here on the screen. First is that instant verifiable credential. It needs to be instant. It's got to be automated or API driven and cryptographic, right? So validation is secure and can happen in seconds. Next, there needs to be enforcement through a credential lifecycle, right? So you need to have that automated issuance, renewal, expiration, and ability to revoke as needed. And it can't be manual, right? It can't be something that requires a lot of burden or heavy touch, right? So how do you create actual lifecycle enforcement? Next, you can machine readable across systems. It can't live in one issuer platform. Credentials need to integrate across systems, HR systems, compliance systems, academic institutions, et cetera. They all need a way to talk to each other and interact. Next is that audit ready capability, right? So you need to be able to audit and complete and have that complete credential history on demand. And lastly, it needs to be durable over that time and geography, as I mentioned before, right? So it can't depend on a single platform staying live forever. It needs to be persist independently, right? So credentials can remain verifiable even as systems change, as people move, as organizations shift, et cetera. And the difference between, and that's really the difference between enterprise grade trust and static artifacts as they've existed historically. And in order to do that, it requires that credential infrastructure, right? So if we continue forward, when we think about why traditional certifications and badges fail at scale, let's kind of name that gap clearly, right? Traditional certificates are typically that one-time issuance, as I mentioned. They're static. They're usually issuer dependent, and they rely on individual sharing. And they weren't really designed for things like necessarily for diplomas or they were originally designed for things like diplomas and completion certificates, not for the way that we think about certificates and credentials in the world today, right? So that's certainly the challenge with the legacy model. When we think about digital badges, certainly that improved things, right? So a few things improved. It certainly made it easy to share through social platforms and portfolio and better visibility and more metadata. But even with that, there's still fundamentally static artifacts without a lot of governance. And that's ultimately why things fail when we think about enterprise scale. They just don't provide those capabilities, right? Again, I don't want to repeat myself, but they don't provide that lifecycle enforcement, that auditability, the cross system verification, enterprise governance, et cetera, right? So that is a huge problem statement, and ultimately, as Jeff mentioned in the introduction, what we believe most organizations are either facing today or will face in the future as the demands and requirements continue to, and expectations continue to broaden. Okay, so as we continue to think about the shift to that secure credential infrastructure, it's an important pivot point, right? So it's a shift from credential administration and overhead to thinking about this as a credential infrastructure, right? So secure credential at enterprise scale requires certain capabilities, right? It as I mentioned, it requires that automated verification. And so it means that these credentials need to integrate well with HR, compliance, and academic systems. And they need to scale, that verification needs to scale from hundreds to millions without human intervention. You need those audit trails, as I mentioned. You need it means an immutable record of issuance and verification and status changes, and the complete lifecycle history, right? And so it's compliance ready for regulators. So why that matters is it allows organizations to meet those audit and regulatory requirements without extensive, heavy manual gathering. The governance is built right into the credentials themselves. And so it enforces organizational policy automatically. Access controls determine who can issue, verify, and revoke. Rules are embedded into the credential structure itself, and they're not scattered across all these external systems, right? So, and that, for obvious reasons, helps to get policies get enforced consistently and reduce, all that human intervention and error that comes with that. Next, when we think about a secure credential infrastructure, we believe that the cryptographic proof of authenticity is super important, right? And so this is tamper-proof credentials that are anchored on the blockchain and verified through that, and it's an independent verification that doesn't require issuer system access. So that you don't need to effectively integrate or exchange information with the issuer. Instead, you have that immutable blockchain proof of it, and so that trust persists even as the issuer systems change or fail, and especially being built on the blockchain, the credential misuse becomes dramatically harder, as does fraud, right? And lastly, we talked about that life cycle enforcement, so I won't go too far into it. So that is really what secure credentialing when we talk about what that means at enterprise scale. It's really the infrastructure and all the capabilities needed, not just, sort of pretty looking certificates that you can share on LinkedIn. So with that, I think Jeff is going to keep walk us through what that means and how do we do that within our product suite.
Thank you so much, Christian. If we can go to the next slide, please. Great. Christian's done a fabulous job of framing the problem, right? We kind of looked at what we had, paper-based. We moved to digital, but digital is kind of a one-off, right? The inability to manage that, right? And so what we're really looking at trying to do is define the enterprise standard. And so we'd like to talk about what that solution could look like for you. So if we go to the next slide, please. So this is where we're introducing our Certs 365 by AI Labs solution. So if you think about it, Certs 365 is an enterprise-grade credential infrastructure, which is designed to move beyond our traditional certificates and badges, right, that Christian outlined before, right? Think kind of before and now, right, the future. So the key word here is really infrastructure. So Certs 365, it doesn't just provide a nicer PDF generator. It's just not a badge image generator. It really becomes the trust layer that allows credentials to be governed, verified, audited, and enforced over time. And from this point forward on the deck, we're going to translate what that infrastructure means operationally, what it means for compliance, what it means strategically for organization that need to scale without sacrificing trust. The next slide, please. So let's make it real. So this slide compares the traditional model to the infrastructure model. So before Certs 365, your verification teams were overwhelmed. And it may be the same today, right? You get manual lookup requests, you get email verifications, turnaround times become 2 to 3 weeks in busy periods. And before Certs 365, compliance is reactive. Teams are scrambling during audits, right? Manually gathering data, trying to export reports, or if they can, or cobbling them together in Excel. And records typically are incomplete or inaccurate. And again, before Certs 365, you had no lifecycle control. So you might have credentials that have expired, but they keep circulating. And there's no automations for renewals. Also, your trust depends on issuer systems. So if an issuer's platform fails, the verification would break. And fraud remained a risk because of static documents that were easily forged. Christian touched on that earlier before, with 160%. And there's no real-time validation, right? So the fact is that the documents you may have are not actual verification of skills and knowledge or other information. And again, you wouldn't have that in real time. So now let's flip it over to the other side, right? So after Certs 365, thinking about your new world, right? Verification becomes automated. It becomes API-driven instant validation with zero manual overhead. Compliance becomes continuous, right? You have real-time dashboards and audit-ready reports on demand, right? No more of that essentially cobbling together information from different sources into a single CSV or Excel file that you have to upload somewhere. And the lifecycle is governed, right? You have automated expiration, renewal workflows, and instant revocation. So trust becomes cryptographic, right? So you have independent verification that works regardless of your issuer platform status. And when you rely on cryptographic proofs and real-time status, forgery essentially becomes impossible to scale, right? So because an image is no longer the credential, verification becomes the credential itself. So that's why the outcome is so important. Credentials become institutional infrastructure, just not an administrative burden. If we can move to the next slide. So what changes operationally? What's the impact? So this is the operational impact slide, right? So for those that are essentially responsible for credentialing, or maybe stakeholders, or are advising others, is that we have to think about how does this impact, right? And what are some of the positives from this, right? And we're going to talk about 5 changes that essentially help us exact results that then allow us to scale within our workflows and the systems we integrate with. First, verification becomes automated. So before you had the manual lookup, the email verification, the turnaround times, the elongated turnaround times. And now you have API-driven instant verification in seconds, right? So the impact of verification can drop dramatically, right? So from, again, potentially days, weeks, to literally seconds, right? And now what happens is that verification is also 24/7, and you don't have to rely on another human to provide that information to you. Essentially, it's a simple request for that information that's available through that API-driven verification capability. Second, audit preparation times drops dramatically, right? So again, before audits may require multiple weeks, right? Even months potentially, right? As you gather that manual data. Now we can essentially generate compliance reports on demand in minutes. So the impact is fewer gaps. We're going to have fewer missing records, and really a shift from that periodic scrambling, right? That, monthly or quarterly or semi-annual or annually scramble that we've had to continuous readiness. And third is credential fraud reduced to near zero, right? So again, we talked about those static documents before that were easily to imitate through fraudulent activities. And now with cryptographic verification, it makes it impractical or nearly impossible to essentially forge those documents, right? So now you have rapid detection of tampering, fewer successful fraud attempts, and really protection of that institutional reputation. And fourth, compliance becomes continuous, right? So again, you're not looking at just those, audit reports that you generated upon request or essentially became part of the compliance process, but now you can get those real-time dashboards. So are you staying compliant throughout the period, right? Not just that mad scramble at the end, but you can now essentially start to smooth that out over any period because you have that reporting in the fingertips and then can sign those necessary reminders and nudges to individuals to do the work that they need to do to stay compliant. And so your impact now is you're always audit ready, right? As an organization that, has gone through ISO accreditations, right? You always want to be audit ready. You always want to be ready for that assessor to walk in and have that immutable history that supports your regulatory requirements. And fifth, it's that credential trust extends beyond the issuer systems, right? So before the verification broke, if the issuer platform failed or changes, right? There's independent, now after you have this independent cryptographic trust, right? That trust layer that persists indefinitely. And so you now have also the impact, which is portability, right? Before you had no vendor lock-in or before you had vendor lock-in, now you don't, right? Before you had short-term essentially access to information, now you're going to have long-term institutional credibility. And that's what the infrastructure does, right? So we're moving beyond, again, that kind of one-off digital badge hunting, right, that you may be doing today, to essentially having an infrastructure layer, a trust layer that essentially turns that credentialing from a workflow problem into a trust system. We can go to the next slide. So where does this matter most, right? Well, the fact is, really everywhere. You think about it, we have so many needs for verifiable trust layers that we can essentially go to, whether that's, for, again, regulatory purposes, internal compliance, a variety of reasons, degrees, certifications, credentials, et cetera, right? And so we're going to look at that kind of from an institutional standpoint on this slide, starting with universities, right? So global academic credentialing verification without manual overhead, right? You ever kind of scratch your head when you're on LinkedIn and say, hey, is that person really an alumni of this institution, right? It's hard to prove or disprove, right? So alumni verification is a constant drain on staff's time, right? And universities have reputational exposure when credentials are forged or altered. So again, we have the opportunity now to, again, have that immutable trust layer that essentially, that not only the universities, but then that can perpetuate out into, again, those who are looking to hire their university graduates or otherwise engage with the institution themselves. Certification bodies, right? Our sister organization, AI Certs, benefits from this greatly, right? You know that everyone that has an AI Certs credential, that you can trust that credential because it's come through the Certs 365 platform. So literally hundreds of thousands of credentials that have been issued for AI Certs are governed throughout the life cycle of that certificate. Those certificates have a end date, and when they end, you can see, hey, this has expired on that, right? And so certification bodies like AI Certs need that to enforce renewal periods, ensure continuing education, revocation, right? If someone is actually not adhering to the expectations of someone holding that certification, the ability to remove that certification, and the need to prove it when challenged. Enterprises, right? Again, enterprises, whether it's for workforce certification, licensing, compliance tracking, think about all the needs now. Christian hit it at the top, right? In the EU, we have the EU AI Act, right? We have GDPR, we have numerous cybersecurity compliance requirements, right? Whether that's to hold your cybersecurity insurance or for other reasons, organizations have to have verifiable proof that people have taken training, actually passed assessments, or completed other activities, right? So enterprises need to know who's qualified right now and not who was qualified 2 years ago, right? So when a PDF was issued, right? So they need to be able to say, yes, this person, we've provided this person access to this information or trained them on these knowledge and skills, and that it's verifiable. And then there's governments and regulators, right? Having long-term credential authenticity and audit visibility, right? We have institutions that need to demonstrate control, traceability, and defensibility. I've done a lot of work in the U.S. In areas where it's highly regulated and with government requirements. And to be honest, right now it's a lot of badge throwing around, right? And I know I've worked with government agencies who are in that mad scramble to try to gain access to the information that they need to fall into compliance with government regulations, right? Their own regulations. So this provides them that capability as well. And this is exactly why the right frame is institutional trust, right? Going beyond, again, it's Christian alluded to earlier, looking from an individual badge holder to how do we, as an organization, essentially have the ability to have that institutional trust on the credentials and verifiable credentials that our individuals or organizations hold. And again, these are not nice to have improvements, but these are government's requirements. If we can go to the next slide, please. So now we're going to go a little deeper, dive a little deeper into governance and defensibility. So first, we have full life cycle credential traceability. So, what does it mean to be, have a complete history from issuance through expiration or revocation? Every status change, verification event, and policy action is going to be logged. We're going to have an immutable record of who issued, when it was issued, and under what authority, and why it matters that regulators and auditors can trace any credentials lifecycle without manual investigation. Second, we have a privacy-first data architecture. So what it means is minimal personal data stored on-chain, right? So again, all of this is, we alluded to earlier, stored in the blockchain, right? So, but again, we want to minimize the data that's stored there, right? For preserving privacy, verification methods, right? Having regional compliance built in. So verifiers can obtain the credential status without accessing holder personal data, right? Understanding the importance of PII. So why it matters is you can meet global data protection regulations like GDPR that we mentioned earlier, and many others across the globe, while maintaining verification integrity. Third, enterprises access control and governance. So what it means is granular permissions for issuers, verifiers, and administrators, multi-signature approvals for sensitive actions, and department level management with delegation and oversight. Why it matters is accountability at scale without sacrificing security. And fourth, we have automated policy enforcement. So what it means is organizations' rules embedded in the credential infrastructure itself, automatic renewal periods, expiration dates, and role-based access controls for issuance and revocation without relying on manual compliance processes. Why it matters is that policy enforcement becomes systematic. It reduces human error and closes manual oversight gaps. And fifth, immutable audit history. What it means is tamper-proof logs of all credential activities, blockchain-anchored audit trails that cannot be altered, deleted, or backdated, and a permanent record for regulatory defense. Why it matters is it's audit-ready documentation always available. Again, no prep season, no gaps, on demand, all time, always, from anywhere. And on this slide, we also call it the compliance reality, right? Programs operate under regimes like FERPA, SOX, and CCPA, standards like ISO and W3C, et cetera. Those frameworks raise expectations for privacy, auditability, and interoperability. And that's exactly what governance by design is intended to satisfy. Next slide, please. So now let's place Certs 365 in the larger institutional trust ecosystem, right? Trusted credentials start with trusted inputs. If the assessment is not defensible, the credential cannot be trusted. So no matter how nice it looks, again, if it's not defensible, it cannot be trusted. So why build this as a trust stack? So assessment integrity is going to be foundational. It includes AI-powered remote proctoring, identify verification and authentication, real-time incident detection, tamper-proof session recording, and scalability across high concurrency. The role of assessment integrity is simple. Ensure every credential issued is backed by a verifiable, fraudulent-resistant assessment. Next is the credential trust infrastructure, which is Certs 365. What it does is transform credentials, as we've learned, from static artifacts, right? Those singular, badges or PDFs, into governed, verifiable trust assets. Key capabilities are going to include enterprise credential lifecycle management, blockchain-anchored authenticity verification, machine-readable API verification, immutable audit trails and compliance reporting, and policy-driven issuance, renewal, expiration, revocation. So again, as we reviewed before, the role of this stack is to convert verifiable assessments into governed credentials that organizations can rely on. And third are verifying learning records. What they do is track and verify the complete learning journey behind each credential. Key capabilities include verifiable learning activities records, stackable pathways, continuous education tracking, cross-institutional and credit recognition, and lifelong learning portfolio management, right? Who amongst us are not lifelong learners? The role is to provide a permanent, verifiable record of the learning journey that supports each credential. That is an end-to-end trust system built to work together, assessment integrity, credential trust, and verifiable learning records. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to my colleague, Christian.
Thank you, Jeff. That was fantastic. As you all heard, Jeff did a wonderful job describing and being clear, clarifying how Certs 365 represents and builds that enterprise-grade credential infrastructure and designed to move past traditional certifications and badges. And he also did a really great job at the end there talking about its place in the end-to-end trust ecosystem with assessments and credits as well. And so together, those build out the full trust ecosystem available through AI Labs 365. So really, we've talked a lot about this, but at this point, really, organizations face a choice, right? And excuse me, path one is continue down with traditional credential model, continue the manual workflows and continue scrambling and reactive compliance and the fraud risk and reputational exposure that comes with that, and the increased burden on administrative staff. which comes with the costs. And while these are representative benchmarks, I think most people can relate to them, right? Significant hours from staff, and audit preparation is a nightmare, and regulatory risk. And then the hardest, really the hardest cost to recover is that lost institutional credibility, right? That it's impossible to put a price on, but that is the most important thing for all enterprises and for across all industries. And so the outcome is clear there, that credential administration really today, if you choose this path, remains a cost center and a liability. And as we move forward, if we think about path two, it's probably obvious, but the path two is to move to this enterprise grade credential infrastructure that we talked about, right? And on that path, as we said, is the automatic verification. That's in seconds or minutes and API driven. It's that always on audit ready, immutable trails of your credentials. You've got governed lifecycle management at scale, and the near zero fraud protection and management that comes in there, because trust is built on the cryptographic and status is real time, and therefore that compliance that we talked about, especially in light of all the AI regulatory needs and compliance needs, is continuous and always on. And that with that comes the value, dramatically reduced overhead and ability to feel prepared and respond to audits in the way that are required. Much fewer compliance gaps, and really the increase in institutional reputation, because you're not needing to defend that in market with any misuse or fraud that might be occurring, right? So we've been talking about that all day, but at the end of the day, credentials become that trust infrastructure, and not the administrative burden. So who are Certs 365 built for? It's built for organizations with these scale requirements, right? If you issue 1,000 or more credentials annually, or you plan to, if you manage credentials across different regions and departments and institutions, and it's challenging today to coordinate all that, and it's unclear on how to do that. If you need to verify credentials at volume, meaning hundreds of thousands or hundreds or thousands of verifications as well, that's where Certs 365 is invaluable. And it's built for organizations that have these compliance mandates, which, by the way, in the future is going to be almost every organization, right? It's clear, or it seems very clear, that with all the regulations that are either in place or shortly will, as it relates to AI, every organization is going to have some form of compliance mandate one way or the other. And especially if you operate in regulated industries like finance and healthcare or government or education, that's going to, it already is, and the increase, it's only going to increase in demand. So, if you face those audit requirements from things like SOX or ISO, certainly that is a huge part of the positioning here too. And then if you want to build that institute, from a strategic priority perspective, you want to think about becoming an AI frontier organization and build that institutional trust as a competitive advantage. If you want to reduce that overhead, et cetera, that is ultimately where Certs 365 comes into play. And if that describes your organization, in our opinion, the conclusion is really simple, right? You don't just need a way to issue credentials in a nice way that you can share on LinkedIn. You need that trust ecosystem. You need that credential infrastructure. And ultimately, that's what we are talking about today. Okay. So that said, if this sounds like your organization, then Certs 365 provides that enterprise-grade credential infrastructure, and it gives you the ability to do it with scale, without sacrificing trust, a way to automate that compliance and verification, and really to build that institutional credibility we talked about. And that ultimately, we believe, is a strong value proposition market. And it's not about prettier certificates. It's about these durable, governed credentials that exist in an ecosystem built on verifiable trust. And with that, certainly, as we close this, at least as we open up for questions, we would encourage you, if what you heard today makes sense and resonates and is where your organization is positioned or is facing those challenges, we'd love to show you Certs 365. It would be great if you schedule a demo with our team. We can walk through your current credential workflow and your requirements from a compliance perspective and your verification volumes. And then we can think about what that looks like in the future and map it to how Certs 365 can build out that enterprise-grade credential infrastructure and what it looks like in your environment. So with that, we'll open it up for questions. And I think we're doing pretty good on time. We kind of hit our goal here around 35 to 40 minutes. So we got plenty of time for questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Christian. Yes, please just put your questions in the chat and we'll answer them. Christian, I did have one client reach out to us that was unable to attend. He did have a question that they wanted to get answered, which was really about integration, right? So they have HRIS and LMS platforms, and they wanted to know, can Certs 365 integrate with those platforms?
Yeah, it's a great question, Jeff. I wish I had $1 for every time we got that question. We hear it all the time. And really, as we talked about, but want to clarify, Certs 365 is really built in an API first model, and specifically for scale, for these enterprise environments, these enterprise scenarios, right? So we have built pre-built connectors for most of the common LMS platforms, like Canvas and Moodle and Talent LMS. And so the credential issuance can be integrated and happen automatically when someone completes a course or has a certification or whatever achievement or event that might trigger a credential issuance. And then for other integrations, maybe that might be more bespoke or unique HRIS systems, our model is built on a modern API and webhooks, so we have the ability to do the bidirectional sync and ultimately we can integrate and automate that process. So your systems will tell us when to issue or update a credential, and then verification status flows right back into your workflows. And for most organizations, that process is very quick and pretty seamless. We've really focused on that from the forefront on how to do this with as little friction as possible, and getting organizations up and running as quickly as possible. Having been on the other side, worked in the industry in many different ways and managed credential programs, I understand how complicated most traditional organizations or credential systems work today. And so we've really focused on how to minimize that as quickly as possible, and ultimately reduce that zero manual work.
Fantastic. We had another question come in. Is IPFS the core of hashing? I'm not sure if we're able to answer that.
Yeah, did that come in from? Is that Emiliano? Is that how I pronounce it?
Yes.
Yeah, Emiliano, can you maybe say a little bit, go deeper on that if you wouldn't mind?
And why Emiliano's is expanding on that question. Again, it can we just talk about why blockchain is important for regulated industries or, government or, other compliance needs?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm certainly you can jump in here and talk about it as well, but it ultimately it's built into by using blockchain. Privacy is sort of literally built into the DNA of Certs 365. You mentioned it before. We follow the W3C verifiable credentials standard, and we anchor everything on that privacy first infrastructure. So it means that the cryptographic proofs and anchors are only stored in the blockchain, and no personal data ever goes on the chain, right? So ultimately, it supports selective disclosure, and we hear this all the time. I think most of you have faced this in the past. Is a number of scenarios. One, how do credentials move with people, whether they move from employers or different programs, or how does an individual maintain their digital wallet, right? So we support that selective disclosure. And so when a verifier scans the QR or calls API, the credential holder decides exactly what information is revealed, right? So an employer can confirm that a certification is current and valid without ever having the detailed PII that's usually associated with that person and typically how it's done today. And so it's specifically designed to comply with GDPR and CCPA and other regulations and provide that audit trail. And ultimately, it creates that immutable trust.
It looks like Emiliano was able, and again, this is beyond my technical expertise, Christian. Yeah. I'm not sure if you're able to answer it or if we need to bring it to our engineering team, but he's asking if the files can be cross-verified with a CID.
Yeah, I'll have to verify that as well with our engineering team, Emiliano. I think it's a great question. I appreciate it. I just don't want to. I have a sense, but I don't want to confirm something without verifying it. So we'll get back to you on that. Thank you.
So another question. We got some other messages. Okay. Thank you for understanding, Emiliano. We appreciate it. We'll definitely get back to you with that response from our engineering team now. So, Christian, can you speak to what type of measurable time savings or cost reductions early customers have seen from Certs 365? For example, how much faster is it to prepare for an audit? What's a typical reduction in manual verification effort or related activities?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we talked about that, and it's one of the bigger operational wins for our customers. Verification time going, obviously it varies, and different organizations have different processes and have different controls in place, but historically, verification time typically is hours or sometimes days, manual back and forth, and down to literally seconds, right? So using a QR code or a verification API, it literally is can be done instantaneously. And then audit preparation that used to take weeks can now happen in a day or less, depending on how you think about it. Because every credential carries that complete immutable history with it, and you're able to pull that all together in a way that confirms or complies with the requirements. So, it's just a huge reduction in time and cost savings. We talked about it. Really depends on how much time each organization currently spends on it and the volumes. But as I use some of those demonstrable or illustrative examples, and previously, lots of organizations have multiple people spending their entire day and week focused on just these asks, and this allows a dramatic reduction in all that overhead and process with a lot more accuracy and a lot more confidence and trust in the process.
And we have one additional question here. And if any others come in, please feel free to continue to submit. But for a large, global enterprise or a university managing thousands or potentially tens of thousands of credentials, what does a typical implementation time look like from kickoff to going live? And where do most organizations start seeing the real operational value?
Great question. I mean, again, part of what our focus was from the get-go is to really think about those core integration and implementation scenarios for enterprises. And so, of course, it always depends on the scenarios or the nuances of an implementation. But, it is not unusual, and certainly we think it's possible to drive an approach where within a week or two, we can have high value and seeing real operational value coming through, right? Within days of the first week, days within the first week, we do discovery and figure out what's needed and integration patterns. We can start that integration. And then again, it always depends on the complexity and the integration with other downstream or upstream data sources or systems. But it's not unusual to see this full system integration within less than a couple of weeks, or certainly within a month. And so you'll see that operational value, that instant verification and lifecycle management, typically within the first 30 days. But again, I'll caveat that with it always depends on the customer and the specific scenario and the architecture, which we typically will work through with customers.
Fantastic. I don't see any additional questions coming in at this time, Christian. We want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your day today. We realize it's a Friday, so whether it's morning for some of us still, or afternoon or evening, we appreciate you spending the last hour with us. Again, please feel free to reach out to us with any questions you have. We're here, to help advise on, what it means to have, again, those immutable, verifiable certificates, what that looks like in an enterprise trust layer, how you can, potentially migrate from the system that you're, using today that provides kind of those one-off digital badges or PDFs into, an infrastructure that will allow you to, again, more readily and always on, right, to be able to access that information as well. And then again, again, that's part of a suite of platforms. So again, if you're looking for AI proctored exams or assessments, pre-assessments, post-assessments, and then going on to the ongoing management, those are all parts of that tech stack that is available as well. Christian, any parting words before we move on?
Well, just I'd reiterate a giant thank you for those that attended. I really appreciate it. Hopefully, what we talked about today both helped you understand what's going on in the market if you're not already experiencing that. And I would encourage you to reach out and let's walk through a demo and talk about how this exists in real scenario within your infrastructure and making it real. It's always, these conversations hopefully are great and give a sense of what can be done. But ultimately, the real proof is when we're having those conversations in context of what your needs are, and we can do that quickly. Talk through that, schedule a demo, and talk about what it takes to bring that credential infrastructure and ecosystem of trust in your organization. So, just encouraging folks to reach out and get in touch with us. Thank you very much, everybody.
Have a great rest of your Friday and weekend.
All right. Take care, all. Thank you.
Yeah.